As of today's date, 28 states are calling for a state convention to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, impose fiscal restraints, and place term limits on federal officials. And I've been getting more and more requests to cover state conventions and Article 5, so let's talk about what these are, where in the US Constitution they are mentioned, and dispel some of the claims circulating the internet about them. Are you ready? A state convention, as outlined in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, is a special gathering convened to either propose or ratify amendments, which are changes to the Constitution. It involves the election of delegates from each state specifically tasked with considering an amendment. This method provides a way for the people, through their chosen delegates, to directly participate in the amendment process. If you've ever heard the U.S. Constitution referred to as a living document, the amendment process is the reason why. Of the 7 articles written in the Constitution, Article 5 lays out the process for how to go about making changes to the document. When the Constitution was written, it was actually the most desperate hour facing our young nation. Things were going so poorly under our first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, that a Convention of States was called to address the immediate need to make changes to the governing document. We call this fateful Convention of States the Constitutional Convention. And I'm sure there will be a few comments refuting this point that the Constitutional Convention was not a state convention, so let's confirm that the Constitutional Convention was in fact a state convention. Did the states agree that a meeting should take place to make changes to the governing document? Did enough states agree to the meeting? Did they send delegates to the meeting to represent each state in the will of the people? Yep, it's a state convention. Now that we've addressed that, how did each state decide who to send and how many? They did it entirely on their own, according to how each state felt best to handle the issue. Because the Constitution of the nation at the time, the Articles of Confederation, did not actually include anything about state conventions or how to run them. We'll touch more on this in a minute. So, each state essentially chose prominent individuals within their state who were considered capable of representing the state's interests in the discussion about revising the Articles of Confederation. This selection process often involved a combination of legislative votes and political influence within each state. Also of note, Rhode Island chose not to send anybody. They were also last to ratify the Constitution. Actually, Rhode Island was known for casting the lone dissenting vote in many circumstances that prevented action from being taken, at the time often referred to as Rogue Island. But we love you, Rhode Island, for being you. Never stop being Rhode Island. This seems like a good time to bring up false claim number 1 about state conventions under our current Constitution, and that is that it's never been done before. I hear a lot of rhetoric like, there's no instructions on how to run a state convention, so it just can't be done, or how will states ever decide who to send or how many to send? Yes, welcome to the Constitution of the United States. It has very few words and is purposefully vague. Article 5 is just one sentence long and a total of 143 words. We will look at each and every one of them shortly after this. But look, there are not a lot of instructions on how to do anything. But you know what we do have going for us? We are the USA. We can figure this out. When the country was falling apart in 1787, the states called for a convention, sent delegates, figured it out, voted on it, and made a change. All of that without any instruction from their governing document. So yeah, I'm not buying that whole it's never been done and there's no instructions on how to do it argument. Onward. I was making a point earlier at the Constitutional Convention being our most desperate hour. After the delegates realized that the Articles of Confederation were so broken they couldn't be fixed, they wrote a new constitution. And considering their first government document failed in just 8 short years, they weren't super confident that this new one would fare any better. You see, originally, the amendment process looked like this. Under the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states had to unanimously agree on the change. Even back then, with states being so different culturally, religiously, economically, and Rhode Island-y, this was an impossible task. The document was never amended once, and it died. Under Article 5 of the Constitution, the amendment process is more robust in its methods to make changes, which includes state conventions as a method. and less demanding of complete unanimity of the states. The hope of the framers of the Constitution being that a complete revision of the document would not need to occur if important changes could be made when they were needed. I want to impress upon you that this is still not an easy task, and it shouldn't be. But if the change has an enormous amount of support for a long enough time, change can be agreed upon and the document updated. So here's how the amendment process currently works according to Article 5 of the Constitution. Firstly, there are 2 steps to the process. Only when the first step is completed can we move to the second. The framers put this in place to ensure changing the document could not be done easily or quickly. So we have proposal and ratification as the 2 steps, and 2 methods to perform each of these steps. For proposal, the most common way in which an amendment is proposed is by both the Senate and the House of Representatives to vote on it, requiring a 2/3 majority vote to pass. This is extremely challenging in its own right, as Congress is often divided among Democrats and Republicans. In order to achieve 2/3 of their vote in both the House and the Senate means the change must be almost universally appealing. To date, 11,000 plus amendments have been proposed or voted on in this Step 1 process. Only 33 have received 2/3 vote in both the House and Senate and made it to the ratification step. This is a difficult process, but hey, that's the intention. The agreement has to be there to change the governing document of the nation. Now, the other method to propose an amendment to the Constitution is for the states to call a convention of states, to meet, discuss, and then vote upon an amendment or amendments. In order to do this, 2/3 of the states must complete an application to call a state convention, at which point Congress is required to convene a convention. Doing the simple math, 2/3 of 50 states is 33.35, which is rounded up to 34 total states. At the start of the video, I mentioned 28 states are calling for a convention. Kinda. Of the 28, 19 are completely good to go. This means these states have had the application approved in both the state Senate and the state House of Representatives. The other 9 states are currently in the process of working on the application or voting on it in their own state legislatures. So, still a bit far out from actually seeing a convention of states for now, but it's slowly gaining steam throughout the states. And before we go any further talking about state conventions, let's look at the actual wording of the document. The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which, in either case, shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution. So, if 2/3 of the states call a convention for proposing amendments, the Congress shall call a convention for proposing amendments. So first point to notice is that Congress is bound by the document to call the convention. The intention of the Founding Fathers being, if Congress is unwilling to make these changes that the people and states want to see, that there be an alternative method of introducing and proposing these ideas and changes. That being the state convention, to say, here Congress, if you are unwilling to recognize the wishes of the people and states, then we will do the job for you and propose changes we want to see. Looking at Hamilton's writing in the Federalist Papers, it's clear this is the intention. It is this, that the national rulers, whenever 9 states concur, will have no option upon the subject. By the 5th article of the plan, the Congress will be obliged, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the states, to call a convention for proposing amendments. When he writes the Congress shall call a convention, nothing in this particular is left to the discretion of that body, that being Congress, meaning they have to do this. It's not in their discretion to take 2/3 of the state's applications and think about calling a convention. They are required to do so. Remember, much of the Constitutional Convention itself was balancing the newly powerful national government with the existing powers of the state governments. Now, one way to assuage the states and let them know they have a place in amending our Constitution was this secondary method of the proposal process, the Convention of States. The second point to notice is that in either case, proposal by Congress or by convention of states, the proposed amendment shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, meaning state convention amendments should not be considered a lesser amendment or have lesser authority to the congressionally proposed amendments. They are to be equal in every measure. But to make things even more challenging, proposal is simply not enough. Step 2 of the amendment process is known as ratification. So after an amendment is proposed, the states need to decide if they even want the proposed change. Of the 33 amendments to make it to step 2, only 27 have passed this step. And this seems like a good time to bring up false claim number 2 about state conventions. It will be a runaway convention. And the essential argument it's stating is, there is nothing that could limit the convention to a single issue, so the delegates could write amendments that revoke any of our most cherished rights, like our right to peaceful protest, our freedom of religion, or our right to privacy. Okay, there is a lot to unpack here with this claim. For starters, it only works under the assumption that all 50 states would send a disciplined coalition of delegates working in harmony and unity to go outside of their mandated reason for being there, say balancing the federal budget, and then to pass an amendment as outrageous as the one that tears down the Bill of Rights, and then have 2/3 of the other state delegates agree on that. I mean, what? The 50 states can't even agree on whether or not a voter should have to show their identification to vote. And you think they'd supermajority agree on taking away citizen freedoms? In addition to that, we also just talked about the amendment process. You know, it's a 2-step process that includes proposal and ratification. So even if a state convention is held and the states somehow work together and agree on running away with the convention to take away freedoms in the Bill of Rights, and 2/3 of the states also shamelessly vote yes to this scenario, it's still just a proposal. 3/4 of state legislatures would still have to agree to taking away freedoms in the Bill of Rights. We looked at the numbers for how many have been discussed in Congress, how many have been officially proposed, and how many have been actually ratified. The numbers don't lie. The likelihood of this actually happening is extremely low. I think proponents of the runaway convention claim forget these important things. 1, it's truly difficult to get 2/3 of states, or people for that matter, to agree on anything. 2, it's easy to say no to bad ideas. And 3, even if you can somehow get 2/3 of the delegates at the convention to agree on running away with the convention, 3/4 of the state legislatures are going to have to agree to this change as well. And I just realized we haven't talked about how exactly ratification works and what numbers are needed to do so. So let's get to that before going any further. Here's what the Constitution says about ratification. Amendments shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states, or by conventions in 3/4 thereof, as the one or the other mode of ratification may be proposed by the Congress. There are 2 methods to accomplish ratification. The common method of ratification is to have 3/4 of the state legislatures vote yes on the amendment. This involves elected lawmakers at the state level who write laws for their respective states, not the national members of Congress who work in Washington, D.C. to write laws for the entire country. Anyways, if 3/4 of the state legislatures vote yes, the amendment becomes an official change to the U.S. Constitution and usually takes effect on an agreed-upon future date. For 26 out of the 27 amendments ratified, this is how it was done. The uncommon method of ratification is to have 3/4 of the state conventions ratify the amendment. And I know what you're thinking. Didn't we just mention state conventions in the proposal step? Yes, but these ratification conventions would not get to suggest or propose anything. Their only purpose being to vote on whether or not the amendment in question should be made official or not. And the people that make up these state conventions aren't lawmakers. At least, most states they are not lawmakers. You see, it's up to the states to determine who gets to go and represent the state in these ratification conventions. Some states forbid state lawmakers to be a part of them, wanting the actual will of the people to prevail. Other states feel some experienced lawmakers intermixed with the common resident of the state is okay to do. Either way you slice it, there are way less lawmakers in these state conventions, and that's sort of the purpose, to represent the actual will of the people. But here's the thing about state ratification conventions. they can only be called by Congress. The states themselves cannot petition to be a part of this ratification process. So, what would make Congress not want to go through the state legislatures and instead go through state conventions? Let's talk about Amendment 21 real quick. The 21st Amendment is the unicorn of the bunch for a number of reasons. This is the only amendment in the U.S. Constitution that overrides another amendment. The 18th Amendment prohibited the production, sale, and transportation of alcohol for consumption in the United States. It also prohibited the importation of alcohol into the country and its exportation. The amendment was ratified on January 16, 1919, and led to the Prohibition era. The 21st Amendment undid all of this, but Congress, who proposed this amendment, wasn't so sure the pencil-pushing state legislatures would agree to unban the sale of alcohol. In order to ensure the amendment was ratified, they called the state conventions to vote to ratify the document. And remember, because there was little to no instruction from Article 5 about how states were to select delegates and how to vote for the ratification of the 21st Amendment, it was impossible to do, and it never got passed. The end. Oh, wait, no. The states decided how best to choose delegates to represent the will of the people, and they got together and voted to ratify the 21st Amendment. Wow, that false claim about how states won't be able to figure it out because there's no instruction is looking worse and worse now, isn't it? Speaking of which, this seems like a good time to bring up false claim number 3 about state conventions. Extremists and wealthy special interests see it as their best chance to write their far-right agenda into the Constitution. Okay. Wait, all extremists and wealthy special interests are far-right? There aren't any far-left extremists and wealthy special interest groups? Sorry, how do you write a statement like that to blanket only one side? Well, anyways, let's look at this claim for what it is. Can extremists and wealthy special interests use a state convention to write their agenda into the Constitution? They can certainly try, just like they try with their donations to presidential candidates, legislators, and citizen movements to influence laws and amendments. As you can see, for every far-right extremist and wealthy special interest group out there, there is an equally far-left one that's going to push back. It's like the universe balancing itself out. You can bet both sides will be trying to influence the state convention. Look, is this claim completely false? No. This is sadly how the political machine works in America. Wealthy donors and special interest groups have a huge hand in our government, and to be so naive as to believe this amendment proposal process that calls for a state convention is when and how the big bad wealthy people are going to get their way is ludicrous. Worry more about the 30,000 or so bills passed in the lifetime of the House and the Senate. How many of those were corrupted by one side or the other? The presidential handshake deals made under the table? Or how about over half the legislatures in Congress who take up the role of lobbyists for the wealthy donors and special interest groups year after year? It's all corrupt, from top to bottom. And you're worried about a state convention being influenced? But to make this claim and then oppose state conventions, you cannot convince me that taking away the constitutional method of proposing a change through state convention is a more democratic process that will protect America. It is strictly the opposite. Oh, and by the way, here's that website that was just saying that wealthy donors can influence elections and state conventions, asking for donations to influence state conventions. Okay, sorry, I apologize. I don't normally get worked up like that. Shall we wrap it up? In many ways, state conventions are a safeguard to ensure that the voice of the people remains a critical part of the amendment process. And although they've been rarely used, they provide a potential path for the states to have a more active role in shaping the Constitution. Article 5 reminds us that the Constitution was designed to be both stable and adaptable. While change comes slowly and deliberately, the inclusion of state conventions as a method of ratifying amendments ensures that the people and the states always have a voice in shaping our government. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks so much for sticking to the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. We'll make more videos soon.